They called me the family failure, but that day when the honor guard raised their rifles in perfect salute and my commanding officer spoke my real rank aloud for the first time in 15 years, everything changed. The morning mist hung low over Arlington Cemetery, clinging to the headstones like secrets that refused to stay buried. My family stood behind me in their funeral black, whispering about why I had insisted on this particular cemetery, this particular ceremony, for Grandpa's final goodbye. They had no idea they were about to learn who I really was. The weight of my dress blues felt familiar against my shoulders, even though to them I was just wearing what looked like a borrowed costume. In their minds, I was still just Sarah, the daughter who never quite measured up, who worked some vague government job that never seemed important enough to discuss at family dinners. But Grandpa knew. Grandpa had always known. Before I share this story, I want to know you are here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are. I love hearing how far my story reaches. This story is about the weight of secrets and the moment when truth finally breaks free. Growing up in the Morrison household meant living in the shadow of achievement. My older brother Marcus graduated valedictorian, went to Harvard Medical School, became a surgeon everyone bragged about. My younger sister Jennifer got her MBA at 24, started her own consulting firm, made partner before 30. Then there was me, the middle child who seemed to drift through life without direction or purpose. At least, that is what they all believed. Family dinners became a routine of celebrating everyone else while I sat quietly, picking at my food, offering vague responses when anyone bothered to ask about my life. Mom would light up talking about Marcus saving lives in the operating room. Dad would beam with pride discussing Jennifer's latest business triumph. When the conversation turned to me, the energy would shift, voices would get softer, more careful. They would ask about my job in that tone people use when they are trying to be polite about something they find disappointing. I worked for the government, I would tell them. Nothing too exciting. Just paperwork and meetings. Dad would nod and quickly change the subject back to Marcus or Jennifer. The truth was so much more complicated, so much more dangerous, so much more classified than anything I could ever explain. I had been recruited out of college by people who recognized something in me that my own family never saw. While Marcus was studying anatomy, I was learning how to disappear into foreign countries where one mistake could mean death. While Jennifer was building spreadsheets, I was building intelligence networks in places most Americans could not find on a map. While they were climbing corporate ladders, I was rappelling down buildings in the dead of night, carrying secrets that could change the course of history. The phone calls always came at strange hours. 2 in the morning, during Jennifer's engagement party. 4 in the afternoon, right in the middle of Marcus's graduation celebration. I would step outside, answer with a simple hello, listen to coordinates or code names or extraction times, then return to the family gathering with an apologetic smile. Emergency at work, I would explain. They would roll their eyes. What kind of emergency could possibly happen in a boring government office job? If only they knew that emergency meant a diplomat's life hanging in the balance, or a terrorist cell moving faster than expected, or an asset compromised in hostile territory. If only they knew that my boring paperwork was actually intelligence reports that crossed the president's desk, that my meaningless meetings were briefings with generals and cabinet members, that my simple government job required security clearances they did not even know existed. Mom would sigh when I missed Christmas morning because of a work obligation. She never knew I was actually in Syria, helping evacuate American civilians from a war zone. Dad would shake his head when I showed up late to his birthday dinner with dirt under my fingernails and exhaustion in my eyes. He never knew I had just spent 72 hours without sleep, tracking down stolen nuclear materials before they could reach the black market. Jennifer would make jokes about my mysterious job, wondering aloud how anyone could find government work so demanding. She never knew that my work had prevented 3 terrorist attacks on American soil, that her safety, her comfortable life building her consulting empire, was protected by people like me who operated in the shadows. The secrecy was the hardest part. Not the physical danger, not the months away from home, not even the nightmares that came after particularly difficult missions. It was sitting at family dinners while they discussed their accomplishments, their recognition, their success, and knowing I could never share mine. I could never tell them about the commendation letters locked in a classified vault, about the medal ceremonies held in windowless rooms with no cameras, about the lives I had saved that would never make the evening news. I could never explain that my lack of social media presence was not because I was antisocial, but because my face could not exist in public databases. I could never tell them that my apartment was so sparse not because I lacked decorating skills, but because I spent more nights in foreign safe houses than in my own bed. The toll it took on relationships was devastating. I watched Jennifer plan her wedding, surrounded by bridesmaids and college friends, while I struggled to maintain any friendships at all. How do you explain to someone why you disappear for months without warning, why you cannot talk about your work, why you sometimes wake up in the middle of the night speaking in languages they have never heard? I stopped dating after the third man accused me of cheating when I could not explain my absences. I stopped making new friends after a college roommate started asking too many questions about my travel schedule. I learned to live in isolation, carrying the weight of protecting a country that would never know my name. Marcus got married in a ceremony that made the society pages. Jennifer's business was featured in Fortune magazine. They collected accolades and recognition like other people collect souvenirs. Meanwhile, I collected scars and secrets, calluses from weapons training, and memories of places that did not officially exist. My hands told stories my mouth could never speak. The scar on my left shoulder from shrapnel in Afghanistan. The thin line across my palm from a knife fight in Prague. The burn mark on my wrist from a chemical weapon facility in North Korea. Each mark was a badge of honor I could never display, a story of courage I could never tell. The physical training never stopped, even when I was home. I would wake at 5 every morning, run 10 miles before most people had their first cup of coffee. The family thought it was vanity, maybe an eating disorder, definitely some kind of overcompensation for not having a real career. They never knew that my life might depend on being able to run that fast, climb that high, fight that hard. They saw my discipline as obsession. They saw my strength as showing off. They saw my preparedness as paranoia. In reality, it was survival training that never ended, muscle memory that kept me alive in situations they could not imagine. Dad was the most vocal about his disappointment in me. He would introduce Marcus as his son the doctor, Jennifer as his daughter the entrepreneur, and me as just Sarah. The pause before my name said everything. He had tried for years to push me toward what he considered respectable careers. Law school, business school, even graduate programs in subjects that bored me to tears. He could not understand why I seemed content with what appeared to be mediocrity. The irony was crushing. His daughter, who disappointed him most, was actually serving at the highest levels of national security. His child, who seemed to lack ambition, was actually risking her life for ideals he claimed to value. His offspring, who appeared directionless, was actually following a calling more demanding than anything he could comprehend. Mom tried to be more supportive, but her worry came across as doubt. She would ask if I was happy, if I felt fulfilled, if I thought I was living up to my potential. Her concern was genuine but painful. How could I explain that I had never been more fulfilled, that I was living beyond any potential she could imagine, that my happiness came from service to something greater than myself? How could I tell her that her worry about my empty social calendar was misplaced, that I was too busy saving lives to worry about dinner parties? How could I help her understand that what looked like failure from the outside was actually the most meaningful work I could ever do? The loneliness was real, though. Sitting at family gatherings, listening to stories I could not share, achievements I could not discuss, adventures I could not describe. Watching my siblings build normal lives with normal problems while I carried the weight of secrets that could destabilize governments. There were nights I wondered if the sacrifice was worth it, if protecting people who would never know my name was worth losing the connection with people who did. But then I would remember Grandpa. Grandpa had served in Vietnam, came home to a country that did not welcome him, carried his own secrets for decades. He never talked about the war at family dinners, never shared his stories of courage and loss, never sought recognition for his sacrifice. But he recognized something in me that others missed. When I was 8 years old, He told me that some people are called to serve in ways that others cannot see or understand. Some people, he said, are meant to be guardians, protectors who work in silence so others can live in peace. He never asked about my job directly, but he would look at me with eyes that seemed to know, that seemed to understand the weight I carried. When I would come home exhausted from missions I could not discuss, Grandpa would sit with me on his porch, not talking, just being present. He understood the particular loneliness of service without recognition, duty without praise, courage without applause. He knew that some battles are fought in shadows, that some victories can never be celebrated, that some heroes must remain unnamed. In a family that measured worth by visible success, Grandpa valued invisible strength. In a house full of people who needed constant affirmation, Grandpa appreciated quiet dedication. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was in a briefing about emerging threats in Eastern Europe. My phone buzzed with Mom's number, and I stepped outside to answer. Grandpa had collapsed in his garden, she said through tears. Heart attack. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. The meeting I had just left was about preventing a potential war, but suddenly nothing mattered except getting home to say goodbye to the one person who had truly seen me. I requested emergency leave, something I had never done in 15 years of service. My commanding officer looked at me with concern when I explained about Grandpa's death. He knew how rare it was for me to ask for personal time, knew that my dedication to the mission had cost me relationships and normal experiences. He approved the leave immediately and told me to take as much time as I needed. As I packed for the trip home, I realized this might be the last time I would be surrounded by family without someone who understood the real me. The funeral planning became a battleground I had not expected. Mom wanted a simple service at the local funeral home. Jennifer thought we should have a celebration of life at the country club. Marcus suggested a memorial donation to the hospital where he worked. They all had opinions about flowers and music and guest lists. But when I quietly suggested that Grandpa would have wanted a military funeral at Arlington Cemetery, they looked at me like I had lost my mind. He served in Vietnam, I reminded them. He earned the right to be buried with honors among other veterans. They argued that it would be too complicated, too expensive, too formal for a man who lived such a simple life. What they did not know was that Grandpa had not lived a simple life at all. His service record, like mine, contained chapters they had never read. His simple exterior, like mine, hid depths they had never fathomed. His quiet dignity, like mine, came from carrying burdens they could not imagine. I made the calls myself, used connections they did not know I had, arranged for honors they did not know he had earned. When the funeral director called back with confirmation that everything was approved and arranged, Mom asked how I had managed to navigate the military bureaucracy so efficiently. Lucky, I told her. Just lucky. The morning of the funeral arrived gray and cold, with mist hanging low over the cemetery like a shroud. I stood in front of my closet, looking at the dress blues I had not worn outside of classified ceremonies, wondering if today was the day the truth would finally come out. The uniform felt like coming home and stepping into danger at the same time. I pinned my ribbons carefully, each one representing missions my family knew nothing about, campaigns they had never heard of, service they could not imagine. The weight of the medals against my chest was familiar, comforting, like armor made of memory and meaning. My family was already dressed and waiting when I came downstairs. The sight of me in full military dress uniform stopped their conversation mid-sentence. Dad looked confused. Mom looked worried. Jennifer looked skeptical. Marcus looked annoyed, like I was playing dress-up for attention. Nobody asked where I had gotten the uniform or why it fit me so perfectly. Nobody wondered why I knew exactly how to wear it or why the ribbons were arranged with such precision. They saw what they wanted to see, their disappointing daughter trying too hard to honor their grandfather. The drive to Arlington was quiet, full of unspoken questions and growing tension. I could feel them watching me in the rearview mirror, wondering why I seemed so comfortable, so prepared, so familiar with protocols they had never seen before. When we arrived at the cemetery and saw the honor guard already assembled, the military precision already in motion, the ceremony already taking shape beyond anything they had imagined, I watched their faces begin to change. This was not the simple military funeral they had reluctantly agreed to. This was something bigger, something that suggested connections and influence and knowledge they had never suspected I possessed. As we walked toward the gravesite, following the funeral director who kept deferring to me for guidance, I realized that the next hour would change everything between us forever. The honor guard stood at perfect attention, their movements synchronized with military precision that spoke of countless hours of practice and dedication. My family clustered behind me, their whispered questions growing more urgent as they took in the scope of what was unfolding before them. This was not the modest ceremony they had expected. Uniformed personnel moved with purpose across the manicured grounds, each detail orchestrated with the kind of attention reserved for someone of significant importance. I could feel Mom's eyes boring into my back, could sense Dad's confusion radiating like heat, could practically hear Jennifer and Marcus trying to piece together how their failure sister had managed to arrange something so elaborate. The funeral director approached me with a clipboard, speaking in low, respectful tones about the timeline and protocols. He addressed me by rank, a title my family had never heard before, and I watched their faces in my peripheral vision as understanding began to dawn that something was very wrong with the story they had believed about my life for so many years. A colonel approached our group, his chest heavy with ribbons and decorations, his bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to command. When he extended his hand to me, it was not with the polite courtesy one shows to a grieving granddaughter, but with the respect one military professional shows another. Standing there in my dress blues, watching my family struggle to understand what they were witnessing, my mind drifted back to where this all began. I was 22 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in international relations and a restlessness that felt like it might consume me from the inside out. While my classmates were interviewing for entry-level positions at corporations and law firms, I found myself drawn to a different kind of opportunity. The recruiter had approached me after a guest lecture on Middle Eastern politics, impressed by questions I asked that revealed not just knowledge, but an intuitive understanding of global power dynamics. The initial screening process took place in an unremarkable office building in downtown DC, the kind of place you could walk past 1,000 times without noticing. They tested my language aptitude, my physical fitness, my psychological resilience, my ability to think under pressure. What they were really testing, I came to understand, was whether I had the rare combination of intelligence, courage, and moral flexibility required for work that existed in the gray areas between what was legal and what was necessary. When they offered me the position, they made it clear that accepting meant leaving behind any hope of a normal life, any expectation of recognition or glory, any possibility of sharing my experiences with the people I loved. The training was unlike anything I could have imagined. Months in facilities that did not appear on any map, learning skills that were never discussed in polite society. How to kill silently with improvised weapons. How to withstand interrogation techniques designed to break the human spirit. How to disappear into foreign cultures so completely that even surveillance experts would mistake me for a native. How to gather intelligence from sources who would die if their cooperation was ever discovered. How to live with the weight of decisions that could save thousands of lives or start international incidents, sometimes both at the same time. My family thought I had taken a boring desk job with the State Department. They thought my long absences were training seminars or bureaucratic conferences. They thought my vague explanations about paperwork and meetings were signs of a career so mundane it was barely worth discussing. While they were building their impressive resumes and collecting their public accolades, I was becoming someone whose very existence had to remain classified. My real job title could never appear on a business card. My actual responsibilities could never be listed on a LinkedIn profile. My genuine accomplishments could never be mentioned at cocktail parties or family reunions. The first mission that truly tested everything I had learned took place in a country I still cannot name, pursuing a terrorist cell that was planning an attack on American soil. For 3 months, I lived as someone else entirely, speaking a language I had learned phonetically, practicing a religion I had studied but never believed, building relationships with people who would have killed me instantly if they discovered who I really was. The intelligence I gathered led to the prevention of multiple bombings that would have killed hundreds of innocent people. The medals and commendations that followed that success were presented in a windowless room with no cameras, witnessed only by people whose names would never appear in history books. While Marcus was completing his medical residency and Jennifer was climbing the corporate ladder, I was learning that heroism often looks nothing like what people imagine. Real courage, I discovered, was not the dramatic gesture captured in movies, but the quiet decision to walk into danger knowing that no one would ever know what you had sacrificed. True strength was not the kind that could be displayed in gyms or competitions, but the internal fortitude required to carry secrets that could destroy governments, to live with memories that would haunt ordinary people for the rest of their lives, to continue serving even when the cost felt like it might break you. The missions blurred together over the years, each one demanding something different, each one teaching me something new about human nature and global politics and my own capacity for both compassion and ruthlessness. I infiltrated criminal organizations in Eastern Europe, gathering evidence that led to the dismantling of human trafficking networks. I posed as a journalist in South America, documenting atrocities that would eventually reach international courts. I worked as a translator in the Middle East, building relationships with local assets who provided intelligence that prevented terrorist attacks across 3 continents. Each time I came home between assignments, the disconnect with my family grew more pronounced. They would share stories of their professional triumphs while I sat silently, unable to mention that I had just spent 6 months preventing a civil war or stopping the proliferation of chemical weapons. They would complain about work stress while I processed trauma from situations they could not imagine. They would discuss their 5-year plans and career goals while I lived in a world where planning beyond the next mission was a luxury I could not afford. The physical toll was evident to anyone who looked closely, but my family had stopped looking closely years ago. The scar on my shoulder from the Kabul embassy extraction. The slight limp from the helicopter crash in Somalia. The way I automatically scanned every room for exits and threats. The fact that I could not sleep without checking the locks 3 times. The hypervigilance that made me exhausting to be around for people who lived in the comfortable assumption that they were safe. They attributed my quirks to stress from my boring government job, never imagining that my boring government job involved scenarios that would give most people nightmares for the rest of their lives. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest part of the sacrifice. Watching my siblings build networks of friends and colleagues who knew them, truly knew them, while I maintained relationships based on carefully constructed lies. Jennifer's engagement party, where she was surrounded by people who celebrated her achievements and supported her dreams, while I stood in the corner making small talk with relatives who thought I was wasting my potential. Marcus's graduation from surgical residency, where he was lauded for his dedication to saving lives, while I sat in the audience knowing that my work had saved exponentially more lives, but could never be acknowledged. The romantic relationships that failed because I could not explain my absences, could not share my experiences, could not even reveal my real name in some contexts. The friendships that withered because I could not maintain the consistent contact and emotional availability that normal relationships require. The family bonds that stretched and frayed because I could not bridge the gap between who they thought I was and who I actually was. The loneliness of living multiple identities while never being able to fully inhabit any of them. But through it all, there was Grandpa. He never asked direct questions, but his eyes held an understanding that told me he recognized something familiar in the way I carried myself, in the careful way I spoke about my work, in the particular kind of exhaustion that followed my trips. He had served in an era when military service was more openly honored, but he understood that some forms of service remained invisible by necessity. When I would visit him between missions, he would tell stories about Vietnam that he had never shared with the rest of the family, tales that revealed the complexity of serving your country in ways that could not be simplified into heroic narratives. He taught me that the measure of service was not in the recognition received, but in the willingness to give everything for something greater than yourself. He showed me how to carry the weight of necessary secrets without letting them crush your spirit. He demonstrated how to maintain your humanity while doing work that sometimes required you to suspend normal moral constraints. Most importantly, He helped me understand that the sacrifice was worth it, that protecting the freedom and safety of people who would never know my name was the highest calling I could answer. The years accumulated like layers of sediment, each mission adding to the weight of experience and responsibility I carried. Promotions came quietly, without fanfare or celebration. Commendations were filed away in classified vaults where my family would never see them. My security clearance reached levels that required psychological evaluations and polygraph tests every few months. My apartment remained sparse because I spent more time in foreign safe houses than in my own bed. My bank account grew from hazard pay and combat bonuses that I could never explain to anyone who asked about my financial situation. By the time Grandpa's health began to decline, I had reached a level of seniority that allowed me more input into my assignments, more time at home between missions, more opportunity to visit him during his final months. He never asked about the medals he sometimes glimpsed when I changed clothes quickly, never questioned the weapons training calluses on my hands, never probed about the nightmares that sometimes woke me when I stayed overnight at his house. But he would sit with me on his porch, sharing comfortable silence that acknowledged the weight we both carried from our different eras of service. When he died, I felt like I was losing the only person who truly understood the cost of the choice I had made. The only family member who recognized that what looked like failure from the outside might actually be the highest form of success. The only relative who valued sacrifice over recognition, duty over glory, service over personal advancement. As I made the arrangements for his funeral, I realized that this ceremony would be not just a goodbye to him, but a revelation to my family about who I really was. The honor guard commander approached me now, his bearing formal, but his eyes kind. He spoke quietly about the timeline for the ceremony, the protocols that would be followed, the significance of the honors being rendered. My family stood close enough to overhear fragments of the conversation, words like classified service and distinguished career and national security that did not align with their understanding of my boring desk job. I could see the pieces beginning to connect in their minds, could feel their confusion transforming into something that might eventually become understanding. As we took our positions for the ceremony to begin, I felt the weight of 15 years of secrecy pressing against my chest like a physical force. In a few minutes, my commanding officer would speak words that would shatter the carefully constructed fiction my family had believed about my life. The truth about my service, my rank, my accomplishments, my sacrifices would finally be spoken aloud in front of the people who had dismissed me as their greatest disappointment. The daughter they thought had wasted her potential was about to be revealed as someone who had served at the highest levels of national security, who had prevented terrorist attacks and stopped international crimes and risked her life repeatedly for causes greater than herself. The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing the full scope of the ceremony that had been prepared. Honor guards from multiple branches of service stood at attention. Military officials whose presence indicated the significance of what was about to unfold. A level of protocol and respect that could only be accorded to someone whose service had been exceptional, whose sacrifices had been profound, whose contributions had been vital to national security. As I watched my family take in the magnitude of what they were witnessing, I prepared myself for the moment when the silence would finally be broken and the truth would change everything between us forever. The ceremony began with the crisp command of the honor guard captain, his voice carrying across the cemetery with military precision that cut through the morning air like a blade. My family stood frozen behind me as 7 uniformed soldiers raised their rifles in perfect synchronization, the movements so practiced and precise that they seemed like a choreographed dance of respect and remembrance. But this was not just for Grandpa anymore, and everyone present was beginning to understand that fact. The first volley echoed across Arlington like thunder, causing Mom to gasp and clutch Dad's arm, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and growing comprehension that something far beyond their expectations was unfolding before them. Colonel Martinez stepped forward to the podium, his chest decorated with ribbons that told the story of a lifetime of distinguished service, his bearing commanding the kind of respect that only comes from leading soldiers through impossible situations. When he began to speak, His words carried the weight of official recognition, the gravity of classified truths finally being spoken in the light of day. He talked about sacrifice and service, about duty performed in shadows where recognition was impossible and gratitude could never be expressed. He spoke about the kind of courage that operates without witnesses, the kind of heroism that can never be celebrated in public, the kind of dedication that costs everything and asks for nothing in return. Then he turned to look directly at me, and the words that came next would shatter 15 years of carefully maintained fiction. He spoke my real rank for the first time in front of my family, the title that carried weight in rooms where national security decisions were made, but had never been spoken aloud at a family dinner. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd like a declaration that could not be taken back or misunderstood. Special Operations, Intelligence Division, 15 years of classified service to the United States of America, multiple commendations for actions that remain sealed under national security protocols. I felt the shock ripple through my family like a physical force. Dad's face went completely white, his mouth opening and closing without sound as his brain struggled to process what he was hearing. Mom's hand flew to cover her mouth, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks as the magnitude of what she had missed, what she had misunderstood, what she had dismissed began to crash over her in waves. Jennifer's carefully composed expression cracked completely, her successful executive facade crumbling as she realized that her disappointing sister outranked most of the military officials she had ever met. Marcus stood perfectly still, his surgeon's hands trembling slightly as he tried to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the decorated officer being honored before his eyes. Colonel Martinez continued speaking, his words painting a picture of service that my family could never have imagined. He talked about operations in hostile territories where one mistake could have meant death or international incident. He mentioned counterterrorism activities that had prevented attacks on American soil, intelligence gathering that had saved countless civilian lives, missions so sensitive that even their existence had to remain classified long after their completion. He spoke about leadership under impossible pressure, about decisions made in split seconds that had ramifications across multiple continents, about a level of responsibility and expertise that few people ever achieved in any field. The medal presentation began, and each ribbon pinned to my chest told a story my family was hearing for the first time. The Bronze Star for valor in combat operations they had never known I participated in. The Intelligence Commendation Medal for actions that had prevented a terrorist attack during what they thought was a boring business trip to Europe. The Joint Service Achievement Medal for work with international agencies to dismantle human trafficking networks while they believed I was attending conferences about budget allocations. Each decoration represented moments when their family failure had been risking her life to protect people she would never meet, serving causes she could never discuss, making sacrifices she could never explain. As the honor guard folded the flag that had draped Grandpa's casket, I watched my family's faces transform from confusion to understanding to something that looked like shame mixed with pride and regret. The precision of the ceremony, the level of respect being shown, the obvious importance of the officials present, all of it painted a picture that contradicted everything they had believed about my life for the past 15 years. The daughter they had written off as directionless had been serving at levels of government they had only read about in newspapers. The sister they had pitted for her lack of ambition had been pursuing missions that required more courage and skill than anything they had ever attempted. When Colonel Martinez presented me with the folded flag, he spoke quietly enough that only I could hear, but his words carried the weight of official recognition that had been too long delayed. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said, "and your service to this country has been exemplary under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The sacrifices you have made, the successes you have achieved, the lives you have saved, all of it represents the highest ideals of military service and personal dedication. Today we honor not just your grandfather's memory, but your own continuing commitment to protecting the freedom that allows families like yours to live in safety and peace." The formal ceremony concluded, but the real reckoning was just beginning. As the honor guard dispersed and the military officials offered their final respects, My family stood in stunned silence, trying to process the complete upheaval of everything they thought they knew about me. Other attendees began approaching, people I had worked with over the years who had been granted permission to attend now that my cover was partially blown. Colleagues from various agencies, fellow officers I had served with in different capacities, even a former ambassador who remembered my work during a particularly dangerous evacuation operation. Each conversation my family overheard added another layer to their growing understanding of who I really was. Stories of operations I had led, crises I had helped resolve, situations where my expertise had been crucial to protecting American interests abroad. The boring government employee they had dismissed was revealed to be someone whose phone number was in the contacts of generals and cabinet members, whose opinions were sought on matters of national importance, whose absence from family gatherings had often been because she was literally saving lives in circumstances too dangerous for most people to imagine. Dad was the first to approach me after the formal proceedings ended, his face a mixture of emotions I had never seen before. The man who had introduced me as just Sarah for so many years now looked at me like he was seeing a stranger, someone whose existence had been hidden in plain sight for decades. His voice shook when he spoke, asking how long I had been serving, how he could have missed so much, how the daughter he thought was wasting her potential had actually been achieving things he could never have dreamed possible. The pride in his eyes was complicated by regret, by the recognition of how wrong he had been, by the weight of years of dismissal and disappointment that now seemed not just unfair but cruel. Mom's reaction was more immediate and emotional, tears streaming down her face as she reached out to touch my uniform like she needed physical confirmation that what she was seeing was real. She kept repeating that she was sorry, that she had not known, that she had been so worried about me for all the wrong reasons. The mother who had spent years concerned about my empty social calendar and lack of career advancement was now learning that her daughter had been serving in ways that required the highest security clearances, that her apparent isolation had been necessary for national security, that her mysterious absences had been protecting the very safety and freedom her family took for granted. Jennifer's response was perhaps the most complex. Her successful business executive persona struggling to process that her underachieving sister had been operating at levels of responsibility and authority that dwarfed anything in the corporate world. She asked hesitant questions about my rank, about the operations I had been involved in, about the scope of responsibilities I had been carrying while she was building her consulting empire. The sister who had always been slightly condescending about my career was now realizing that my work had impact on a global scale, that my decisions had life and death consequences, that my expertise was valued by people who shaped international policy. Marcus, ever the analytical surgeon, wanted to understand the timeline, to map out when my real career had diverged from what the family believed. He asked about my training, about the skills I had developed, about the physical and psychological demands of the work I had been doing. The brother who had always been proud of his life-saving work in the operating room was now confronting the reality that his sister had been saving lives on a much larger scale, preventing attacks that could have killed thousands, stopping threats that could have destabilized entire regions. As we stood together in the aftermath of revelation, other family members and friends who had attended began to approach with questions and comments that revealed how completely my cover story had fooled everyone. Cousins who had felt sorry for me at family reunions, aunts and uncles who had wondered aloud why I seemed so directionless, family friends who had suggested career advice and networking opportunities, all of them now learning that their pity and concern had been misplaced, that the family member they thought was struggling had actually been succeeding at the highest levels of public service. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had as a family. For the first time in 15 years, I could answer their questions honestly, within the limits of what remained classified. I could tell them about some of the training I had undergone, about the general nature of the work I had been doing, about the reasons for the secrecy that had separated me from them for so long. I could explain why I had missed so many family events, why my answers about work had always been vague, why my apartment was so sparse and my social life so limited. The hardest part was helping them understand the weight of the sacrifice involved, Not just the physical danger, but the emotional cost of living a double life for so many years. The loneliness of carrying secrets that could never be shared, the isolation of being unable to form normal relationships, the burden of watching them celebrate achievements while being unable to share my own. I tried to help them see that the choice to serve in this way had been mine, that I had found meaning and purpose in work that required complete anonymity, that protecting their safety and freedom had been worth the personal cost. Dad asked if I was angry with them for not understanding, for not seeing who I really was, for treating me like a disappointment when I was actually serving my country with distinction. The question revealed how deeply the revelation had shaken his understanding of himself as a father, of his ability to know and support his own children. I told him that the secrecy had been necessary, that their reaction had been normal given the information they had, that my choice to serve in this capacity had always included accepting the cost of their misunderstanding. Mom wanted to know if I was safe, if the work I was doing was still dangerous, if there were threats to my security that she should be worried about. Her maternal instincts, finally understanding the real scope of what I had been facing, were struggling to process years of worry about the wrong things while being completely unaware of the actual dangers I had been navigating. I assured her that I had been well-trained, well-supported, and as safe as anyone could be in my line of work, but I could see that her perspective on my life had been fundamentally altered in ways that would take time to fully process. Jennifer asked about my future plans, whether I would continue in this kind of work, whether there might be opportunities for a different kind of service that would allow for more normal family relationships. Her business mind was trying to understand the career trajectory of someone whose work existed outside normal professional frameworks, whose achievements could never appear on a resume, whose networking happened in classified environments with people whose names could never be mentioned in casual conversation. Marcus, practical as always, wanted to know about medical care and psychological support, whether the military provided adequate resources for people doing the kind of work I had been doing. His concern as a doctor was for the long-term effects of the stress and trauma inherent in my service, for the physical and mental health challenges that came with operating in high-stakes environments for extended periods. As the afternoon wore on and we began to leave Arlington, the dynamic between us had shifted permanently. They looked at me differently now, spoke to me with a respect that had been absent for years, asked questions that revealed genuine interest in understanding my experience rather than polite attempts to include me in conversations. The family hierarchy that had placed me at the bottom for so long had been completely reorganized by truth, by the recognition that their standards for measuring success had been too narrow to encompass what I had actually achieved. The drive home was filled with a different kind of silence, one charged with processing and adjustment rather than the uncomfortable avoidance that had characterized so many family interactions. They were beginning to understand not just what I had been doing, but why the secrecy had been necessary, why my behavior had seemed strange, why my responses to their questions had always been so carefully limited. The family failure was revealed to be someone whose success had been measured in lives saved and threats neutralized rather than promotions earned and recognition received. In the weeks that followed, our relationships began to rebuild on a foundation of truth rather than misunderstanding. Family dinners became opportunities for them to ask questions about my experiences, within the limits of what I could share, rather than awkward exercises in avoiding discussion of my disappointing career. They began to understand that my absences from family events had not been due to lack of caring, but to responsibilities that sometimes required immediate response to global crises. The revelation changed not just how they saw me, but how they understood service and sacrifice more broadly. They began to appreciate that some of the most important work being done to protect their freedom and safety was being performed by people whose names would never appear in history books, whose achievements could never be publicly celebrated, whose families might never fully understand the scope of their contributions. Grandpa would have been proud to see his family finally understanding what he had always known about the value of quiet service, of duty performed without expectation of recognition, of courage that operates in shadows so others can live in light. His funeral had become not just a goodbye to a beloved patriarch, but a revelation that would bring his family closer together through truth and mutual respect. The granddaughter he had always believed in was finally seen by everyone else as the hero she had always been.